Eleanor Hale did not scream when the footman told her to stand back from the gate. She did not weep when the gathered guests on the drive turned to look at her rags. She did not drop the child on her hip, though her arms had gone numb an hour before from carrying him the last 3 miles in the rain. She shifted his weight, set her chin, and waited, because waiting was a thing she had grown expert at, the way other women grew expert at needlework or Italian. The Duke of Oldham sat his grey horse at the head of the drive, dressed for a hunt he had not yet ridden, and looked at her the way a man looks at weather he has decided not to dress for. "I keep no bread," he said, "for beggars who breed by my gate." Laughter went through the party behind him, thin and obliging, the kind that costs nothing and means less. Eleanor felt the boy's small hand-fist in the collar of her cloak. She pressed her palm flat against her own collarbone, where a cord lay hidden beneath wool gone thin as paper, and did not answer him yet. By the time the sun went down behind Alden's chimneys, the Duke of Oldham would know precisely whose son he had turned from his door, and he would spend the rest of his life paying the difference. Subscribe to the channel, and let's find out how she made him pay it. Hallishire in the autumn of 1813 had been green in the particular tired way of a county that had given most of its young men to a war and kept farming anyway. Alden Court sat at the top of its valley like a ledger balanced too long on one column, handsome from the road and hollow at the back, its roof needing lead, and its tenant cottages needing thatch, its late Duke having spent 30 years being charming instead of careful. Julian Ashworth had inherited the title at 24, and the debts a fortnight later, and had spent every season since learning the difference between the two the hardest way there is. He had married Eleanor Hale in the spring of that year, in a small stone chapel 2 villages over, with a curate who owed his living to no one in the county, and a housekeeper for a witness. It was not a secret out of shame. It was a secret out of arithmetic. His stepmother, Augusta, the Dowager Duchess, had spent a decade telling him that an unsuitable marriage had once nearly cost the family everything. His own father's first wife, a woman without land or name, whose brief tenure at Oldham had left scandal enough to still be spoken of in Cressbridge assembly rooms 20 years on. Augusta wanted him married to money. Eleanor Hale, daughter of a baronet who had died owing more than his acres were worth, was not money. She was, Julian told himself in the grey months before the wedding, something steadier than money. She kept his accounts straighter than his steward did. She walked his tenant rows and knew which families needed seed and which needed patience. She did not flatter him, which he had not known he wanted until she stopped doing it on purpose to test him, and found he came back for more. He did not tell her he loved her. He told her she was necessary. At the time she had thought that a kind of honesty. She learned later it was a kind of accounting. For 1.5 years the marriage held the shape of a working thing. She ran the house from the inside, while he ran the land from without, and in the evenings they sat over the ledgers together. And there were nights, not many, but real ones, when he laughed at something she said and looked, for a moment, like a man who had forgotten to be careful. She was not foolish. She knew what she had married, a cold house being warmed 1 room at a time. She had decided that was work worth doing. She was 6 months carrying his child when Augusta found the paper that ended it. It was not a true paper. It only had to look true. A letter, in a hand near enough to Eleanor's own, addressed to a gentleman in Bath who did not exist, full of the sort of confession that ruins a woman before anyone troubles to ask her about it. Augusta placed it where Julian would find it, and not where Eleanor could explain it, timed to a week when Julian was away settling a dispute over grazing rights on the county's far edge, exhausted, half sick with worry over money he did not have, primed by 10 years of warnings to believe the very worst the moment it was offered to him in his stepmother's steady, sorrowful voice. He did not ask Eleanor for her account of it. That was the sin the rest of this story exists to make expensive. He came home, read the letter Augusta had already shown to 2 of his own solicitors so that the shame would be public before Eleanor knew it existed, and looked at his wife across the same table where they had once bent over the same ledger, and he did not ask her a single question. "You will take the carriage to Cressbridge tonight," he said. "You will not use my name again." Eleanor Hale did not scream. She did not weep in front of him, though her hands, folded at her waist over the child that was unmistakably his, shook once and then went still, because she had already begun, in that instant, the discipline that would carry her through the next 5 years. She counted herself 3 minutes to grieve, and no more, and she used them standing at the window with her back to him, so he would not have. The satisfaction of watching it cost her anything. "You have not asked me," she said, when the 3 minutes were spent, "whether it is true. I have seen it in your hand. You have seen a hand near enough to fool a man who did not care to look closely." She turned. Her voice did not rise. "That is not the same thing, Julian, though I understand it is more convenient for you if it is." He did not answer her. That was the part she carried longest, not the accusation, which was cruel but at least active, but the silence after, which told her everything about what she had actually been to him. Useful, suitable, until she was inconvenient. A woman is not loved by a man who will not trouble himself to ask her a question, when the asking might cost him his stepmother's good opinion. She left that night with a maid's cloak, a purse Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, pressed into her hand at the servants' door with tears she was too proud to explain, and the ring Julian had put on her finger in that small stone chapel, which she took off before she reached the gate and threaded onto a cord and hung around her neck. Because a woman travelling alone with an unmistakable belly does better as a widow than as a wife whose husband has just disowned her. She was a widow within the month, in every sense but the paper one. The child came early, in a rented room above a chandler's shop in a town 3 counties off, delivered by a midwife Eleanor paid with the last of Mrs. Pratt's purse, and she named him Simon, for her own father, because her own father, whatever his debts, had never once looked at her and seen only her use. She raised him on needlework and letters written for men who could not write their own, and later on the accounts she kept for a miller, who could add columns but not read the totals back to himself with confidence. She was good at ledgers. She had always been good at ledgers. It was, she thought sometimes with a dryness that surprised her, the one useful thing her marriage had properly taught her to be proud of. She did not go back to Hallisher for 5 years. She went back because the miller's trade failed, and because Simon, at 5 years old, had begun asking questions she had run out of ways to answer, and because a woman travelling with a nearly 5-year-old son and no coin left has very few directions to walk in, and only one of them led anywhere she still had a claim, however thin, however denied. She went back because she was, in the end, still his wife, whatever he had told the county, and a wife has a right to stand at her husband's gate and ask. She had not expected to be unrecognised. She had thought of many outcomes on the long walk north, anger, a door shut in her face even, in her more frightened hours, the constables. But she had not properly reckoned with what 5 years of thin meals and hard weather does to a face, nor with how thoroughly a man can unsee a woman he has already decided does not exist. Julian Ashworth looked at his own wife across 20 feet of gravel drive, at the woman who had once corrected his steward's sums in the same hand Augusta had forged, and saw only a beggar with a child on her hip, because he had trained himself for 5 years not to look for her at all. "I keep no bread," he had said, "for beggars who breed by my gate," and the party behind him had laughed, and Eleanor Hale had stood very still and pressed her hand to the ring at her throat and thought, with a calm that surprised even her, "All right. Then we will do it the long way." The gatekeeper was a young man named Tom Kettle, broad through the shoulders, slow to speak and slower to judge, who had let her stand under the gatehouse eve out of the worst of the rain, while the Duke's party rode off toward the covert without a backward look. He did not offer her charity, exactly. He offered her the eve, and later a heel of bread from his own dinner pail. And he did not ask her name, which she was grateful for, because she had not yet decided what name to give. "You'll not get far tonight," he said, not unkindly looking at the sky. "There's a barn at Widow Farrow's, other side of Marrow Fen, takes in travellers for a penny and don't ask questions past that. I'd go there, was I carrying a boy that age." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "You are kinder than your master." Tom Kettle had the grace to look uncomfortable at that, and did not defend the Duke, which told her something about how the county had come to feel about its lord in 5 years of being managed by a cold hand and a colder stepmother, and she filed that away the way she filed everything now, in the same steady inventory that had kept her alive, useful. Remember it. She did not go to Widow Farrow's that night, though she thanked Tom Kettle for the direction and let him believe she had. She went instead to the smaller cottage at the edge of Marrow Fen that had once belonged to her old nurse's sister, and found it, as she had half hoped and half feared, still standing, still kept by the same sister's daughter, a woman named Peg Doyle, who remembered a young bride from 5 years back, with a fondness that had survived even the scandal, because Peg Doyle had never much cared for the Dowager Duchess's version of events. "You'll stay," Peg said, when the story had come out of her in pieces over a pot of weak tea, "and you'll say nothing to nobody till you've had a proper wash and a proper sleep, and then we'll see. I have no money to pay you." "You'll sew," Peg said, "and you'll teach my Annie her letters which she needs and I can't give her, and we'll call it even." She looked at Simon, asleep against Eleanor's shoulder, and something crossed her face that was almost a laugh. "Lord, but he's got the look of a portrait I once dusted in the long gallery up at the court." Little Julian Ashworth, aged about 5, in a blue coat, scowling at the painter, same as that one's scowling at me right now in his sleep. Eleanor said nothing to that. She only held her son a little tighter, and thought that the county's memory, however unwelcome, might yet prove her most useful asset. She began, within the fortnight, to be spoken of. It started small, the way most true reputations do, in kitchens and dairies rather than drawing-rooms. Peg Doyle's Annie could suddenly read a full page of scripture where before she had stumbled over her own name. A farmer named Ezra Coombe, whose accounts had been 3 years in arrears and hopeless muddle, brought his ledger to the Widow Hale on Peg's recommendation, and left an hour later with his sums squared, and a plan, in her clean, careful hand, for paying down what he owed the mill by Michaelmas. She would not take coin from those who had none. She would take a sack of flour, a morning's labour from a son, a chicken. She was, within 2 months, the person Marrow Fen sent its confusions to, quietly, the way a village sends its confusions to whoever proves competent and does not gossip about what they are told. She used the name Hale. It was, after all, her own, and there was a mercy in that she had not expected. No one troubled to ask a widow named Hale whether she had ever been a duchess, because the two ideas did not sit near each other in anyone's mind, least of all the Duke's. She saw him twice in those first months, both times from a distance, both times without being seen herself. Once riding the boundary with his steward, looking thinner than she remembered, and greyer about the eyes than 5 years should account for. Once at the Michaelmas fair in Cressbridge, standing beside a young woman in a green pelisse that cost more than Eleanor's whole wardrobe, a Miss Priscilla Rowe, whose father had made a fortune in wool, and whose dowry, the county said freely and often, was exactly the sum that would put Alden's roof back in lead, and its tenant cottages back in thatch. She felt, watching him from behind a cheese stall, not the grief she had expected, but something closer to arithmetic of her own. He is still solving the problem the same way, she thought. He has simply changed which woman he intends to solve it with. The Dowager Duchess Augusta had not slowed in 5 years. If anything, widowhood, her own husband gone 3 winters back, had sharpened her, given her a freer hand at Alden's affairs than she had ever had while her husband lived, and she had spent that freedom precisely as she had always intended, securing Julian's remarriage to money, before the estate's creditors grew impatient enough to press. She did not know Eleanor Hale had returned to the county. She would not have troubled herself over a widow in Marrow Fen, even if she had, for the same reason Julian had not recognised his own wife at his gate. Because Augusta Ashworth had spent 5 years being quietly, thoroughly certain that the problem she had solved once would never need solving twice. It was Mrs. Pratt who first saw what no one else had thought to look for. The housekeeper had grown old at Alden Court, and had never once, in 5 years, stopped grieving the young duchess she had helped out a servant's door in the middle of the night, with nothing but a maid's cloak, and a purse she could ill afford to give. She went to Marrow Fen on her half-day in November, ostensibly to buy ribbon, and found instead a woman bent over Ezra Cumbé's ledger at Peg Doyle's kitchen table, thinner than memory, older than 5 years should have made her, and utterly, unmistakably herself. "Your Grace, Mrs.," Pratt said, and her voice cracked on the second word, and she had to set down her basket and hold the door-frame. "I am not that any more," Eleanor said, very quietly. "I am the widow Hale, and I would ask you to let me remain so for now, until I have decided what to do with what I know." Mrs. Pratt did not ask what she knew. She sat down instead, heavily at Peg Doyle's table, and looked at Simon, who was practising his letters in the margin of a scrap of paper, with the fierce concentration of a boy who did not yet know what his own face proclaimed to anyone who had dusted a certain portrait for 30 years, and she said, "He has his father's chin. He has his father's exact scowl when he's thinking hard. Lord above, child, does the Duke know?" "The Duke," Eleanor said, "looked at me across his own drive a fortnight past, and offered me no bread." Mrs. Pratt was quiet a moment. Then she said, in the flat, plain voice of a woman who had decided something and would not be argued out of it, "Then he'll have to be shown, won't he? Slowly, and on your terms, and not 1 hour before you're ready. I kept your secret once at a door in the dark. I'll keep it a while longer at a kitchen table in the daylight, if that's what you're asking." "It is." "Then eat something," Mrs. Pratt said. "You're thin as a rail," and that, Eleanor thought, was as close to a treaty as the housekeeper had ever offered anyone, and she accepted it. Winter came down hard over Hallishire that year, the kind of cold that put ice on the water troughs by November and kept it there past March, and it was in that cold, grinding season that Eleanor's reputation in Marrow Fen went from useful to indispensable. A fever moved through the tenant cottages nearest the river, the kind that took the very old and the very young if it was not managed carefully, and the estate's own physician, a Dr. Josiah Fen, who had served the Ashworths for 20 years, found himself short-handed, and by his own admission, short on the particular calm required to nurse frightened families rather than simply prescribe at them. Eleanor Hale, who had spent 5 lean years learning to make a little medicine and a great deal of steadiness go a long way, walked the sick rows for 11 nights running, and lost no one Dr. Fen had not already privately given up. It was on the 9th of those nights that Julian Ashworth first noticed her, though he would not have described it that way, and would not have been able to say what exactly he noticed. He had ridden down to the river cottages himself, as he did every winter when the fever came, because whatever else he had become, he had not become a man who let his tenants suffer unvisited, and he found a woman kneeling at old Widow Coates's bedside with a cool cloth, and a voice pitched low and even, saying something that made the old woman, half out of her wits with fever, actually laugh, a dry papery sound Julian had not expected to hear in that room at all. He stood in the doorway a long moment before either of them noticed him. The woman had her back to him, a plain dark cloak, hair pinned up without ornament, hands that moved with an economy he recognized without being able to place, the same brisk, unshowy competence he associated, distantly and uncomfortably, with a table and a ledger and a marriage he had trained himself not to think about. "Who is that woman?" he asked Dr. Fen afterward, low, on the path back toward the horses. "The Widow Hale, Your Grace. Come to the county some months back. I don't know what we'd have done without her this fortnight, and that's the plain truth of it." "Hale," Julian repeated, and something in his chest did a small, unaccountable thing. A door opening a crack in a room he had bricked shut 5 years before. And he did not investigate it, because investigating things had cost him too much once already, and he had built a very careful life on the principle of not investigating things twice. He noticed her again in January at the church at Marrow Fen, 3 pews ahead of his own, a boy of perhaps 5 beside her sitting unnaturally still for a child that age, the way children sit still who have learned early that stillness is safer than being noticed. Julian watched the back of the boy's head through most of the sermon, and could not have said why, only that something in the set of the small shoulders pulled at him the way a familiar tune pulls at a man who cannot place the words. He did not approach her. He told himself this was propriety. It was, in truth, the same cowardice that had cost him everything once already, dressed now in 5 more years of practice, and he did not yet know it by its right name. His stepmother knew nothing of any of this, being occupied that whole winter with the far more pressing business of Miss Priscilla Rowe, whose father had at last agreed to a spring wedding on terms so favourable to Eldon's creditors that Augusta had wept. Actually wept. A thing Eleanor would have found difficult to credit, had she known of it, with relief at her own dressing-table. The engagement was to be announced formally at the county assembly in March. Augusta had in fact already begun drafting the notice for the Hallisher paper, in the same confident hand that had once drafted a letter to a gentleman in Bath who did not exist. And it did not occur to her, not for one moment, that the woman she had erased 5 years before might still be within 30 miles of the drafting. It occurred to Julian only once, in the depth of that winter, on a night he could not sleep and did not examine too closely why. He found himself in the estate's small chapel, not the parish church, but the old private one, disused for decades, where his father had kept, among other neglected things, a chest of parish registers going back a century. He did not know what drew him there. He told himself later it was simple restlessness. He sat for an hour in the cold with a lantern and did not open the chest, and rode back to the house before dawn feeling. Without being able to say of what, robbed, it was Simon who broke the standoff, because children do not observe the careful architecture adults build to avoid each other, and because a boy of 5, who has been told all his short life that his father was a good man, lost to. Circumstance has, eventually, questions no widow's careful evasions can indefinitely satisfy. It happened in April, at the edge of the home wood that bordered both Alden Courts Park and the lane into Marrow Fen, a stretch of ground technically the Duke's and practically everyone's, where village children had fished the shallow brook for generations without anyone troubling to stop them. Simon had gone ahead of his mother with Peg Doyle's Annie to look for tadpoles, and Julian, riding the bound alone in the grey hour before his household woke, came upon a boy crouched at the water's edge with an expression of such fierce, familiar concentration that he reined in his horse without quite meaning to. "You'll want a jar," Julian said, before he had decided to speak at all, "not your hands. They'll slip through your fingers else." The boy looked up. He had grey eyes in a thin face, and a chin that set itself, when he was thinking, in a way that struck something loose in Julian's chest so hard it was nearly a physical blow. "I haven't got a jar," the boy said. No, Julian dismounted, because his legs had made the decision before his mind caught up to it, and crouched at the water's edge a careful distance off. "Try your hat, then, cup it under, slow, and don't chase them. Let them come to the shadow." The boy tried it. It worked, more or less, on the 3rd attempt, and he made a small sound of triumph that Julian felt in his own 5-year-old chest, in a memory he had not visited in decades, of a summer morning very like this one with his own father, before everything, before scandal and debt and the careful cold architecture of a man who has decided feeling costs too much. "What's your name?" Julian asked, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Simon," the boy said, and then, because he was 5, and because he had been told all his life that he had a father somewhere in the shape of a good man lost to circumstance, and because something about the man crouched beside him at the water's edge felt, with the unerring instinct children have and adults train themselves out of, correct in a way he had no words for, he said it. "Father?" The word dropped into the April morning like a stone into still water, and every ring it sent out reached Julian at once, the grey eyes, the chin, the housekeeper's strange stiffness whenever the widow Hale's name came up, the woman 3 pews ahead at Marrow Fen Church, who moved with an economy he had spent 5 years refusing to name. He did not answer. He could not. He knelt at the edge of that brook, with a boy's damp hat full of tadpoles between them, and felt the entire careful architecture of 5 years come down around him without a single sound. "Simon," the voice came from the lane above them, even, controlled, and utterly familiar in a way that made the last wall fall. Eleanor Hale stood at the top of the bank with Annie Doyle's hand in hers, and she was not thin the way a beggar is thin. She was thin the way a woman is thin, who has carried a family through 5 winters on her own arithmetic, and she looked down at her husband kneeling in the mud beside their son with an expression Julian could not read at all, because he had never learnt to read her when it mattered. And that, more than anything else in that whole terrible bright morning, was the thing that broke him open. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in 5 years, and it came out of him like something torn. "Your Grace," she said, and the formality of it landed exactly as she intended it to. A closed door, where he had expected, absurdly, to be let straight back in. He got to his feet. Mud on his knees, on his hands, on a coat that cost more than Peg Doyle's cottage rented for in a year. And none of it mattered to him in the slightest, which was itself a thing he noted with distant surprise, that he who had spent 5 years counting the cost of everything found himself, in this one moment, counting nothing at all. "I did not know," he said. "I swear before God, Eleanor, I did not know you. You did not ask," she said, and her voice did not rise, which is the same failure that sent me from your gate a fortnight ago, and the same failure that sent me from your house 5 years before that. I have grown very tired, Julian, of being a woman you draw conclusions about, instead of a woman you address a question to." Simon looked between them, hat of tadpoles forgotten, dripping onto his shoes, with the wide, unblinking attention of a child who understands that something enormous is happening and does not yet have the vocabulary for it. "I am asking now," Julian said. "Then ask properly," Eleanor said, "in a place where I need not stand in mud to answer you, and be prepared, when I do answer, that I will not be hurried into forgiving 5 years in a single morning, simply because a child said a word you were not braced to hear." She held out her hand to Simon, who came to her at once, casting one backward look at the man in the muddy coat that was equal parts longing and confusion, and Julian watched them go up the lane toward Marrow Fen without moving to stop her, because he understood. In the one lucid part of his mind still functioning, that stopping her would be one more instance of the very sin she had just named, and that if there was ever to be a way back to her, it would not run through force. He rode home at a walk, letting the horse pick its own pace, and did not go in to breakfast, and sat instead in the estate office among ledgers he had once kept with a wife, who understood them better than he did, and put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 5 years allowed himself to feel the full weight of what his own cowardice had cost, without once trying to argue himself out of the feeling. He went to Peg Doyle's cottage that same afternoon, on foot, having sent his horse back with a groom, because he did not want the county to see the Duke's carriage at the widow Hale's door before he had earned the right to be there in any capacity at all. Eleanor received him in the small front room. Simon sent to the kitchen with Annie, and a slice of bread he went reluctantly, and stood with her hands folded at her waist, in the exact posture Julian remembered from the night he had sent her away, as though she had kept that stance in reserve for 5 years against precisely this occasion. "Say it plainly," she said. "I have not the patience left for anything else." "I believed a lie," Julian said, "because the lie was easier than the woman who told me the truth. My stepmother showed me a letter, and I did not ask you a single question before I sent you from my house, and I have told myself for 5 years that I did it to protect the estate, and that was also a lie, because what I protected was my own comfort, my own certainty, that I had not married beneath the family's interest, and been made a fool of it. I was afraid, Eleanor. I have been afraid since I was a boy, watching my own father's marriage nearly ruin us, and I built my whole life on the principle that fear was the same thing as prudence, and it cost me you, and it cost me 5 years of my son, and there is no accounting I can offer that squares that ledger. I know that. I am not asking you to tell me it squares. I am asking for the chance to begin paying it down." Eleanor listened to the whole of it without moving, and when he finished she was quiet long enough that he began to fear she would not answer at all. That, she said at last, is an explanation. It is not yet an apology, and I will have both before I have anything else from you, spoken separately, because a man who has learned to fold the two together has usually learned to hide inside the explanation. Then I am sorry, Julian said, simply, not sorry that it happened to me. Sorry for what I did to you. There is a difference, and I did not always know it, and I know it now. That is closer, Eleanor said. It is not enough on its own. Words are cheap, Julian. You taught me that yourself, the night you sent me away with none. I will want more than words before I want anything else from you, and I will tell you plainly what the more looks like, so you are not left guessing at it and calling your guesses gallantry. Tell me. I want proof, she said, over time, not over an afternoon. I want my son's parentage acknowledged before this county with the same public thoroughness with which I was once denied it. I want my own authority in whatever house Simon is raised in, not asked for as a favour, but granted as a right, because I have spent 5 years proving I know how to exercise it responsibly, and I will not go back to being managed. And I want to know exactly how the letter that ended my marriage came to exist, because I do not believe, Julian, that you were its only fool. Julian's jaw tightened. Augusta, I make no accusation I cannot prove, Eleanor said. But I would ask you to consider, before you go to your stepmother tonight full of righteous fury on my behalf, that a man who acts first and asks questions after has already made that mistake once in this story, and I would rather he not make it twice. Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that was almost, despite everything, a wry and painful appreciation. You are still better at this than I am. I have had more practice, Eleanor said, at surviving the consequences of men who were not. He did not press her for more that afternoon. He asked only, before he left, whether he might be permitted to see Simon again, and Eleanor considered it and said, on the drive, in the daylight. Where the boy's welfare is the only question being answered, and Julian said, all right, and Eleanor said, all right then, and it was, in its small plain way, the first treaty of the rest of their lives. The document that would unmake Augusta Ashworth's 5 years of careful management surfaced in pieces, the way documents in this kind of reckoning always do, not in one dramatic discovery, but in a slow accumulation that Eleanor, methodical as ever, assembled the way she assembled any ledger. Entry by entry, source by source, refusing to accept a single claim she could not corroborate twice over. Mrs. Pratt provided the first piece, without quite meaning to. Sitting with Eleanor over tea at Peg Doyle's table, turning the old grief of that night 5 years back, she recalled, almost as an aside, that Augusta had paid a call to Dr. Fenn's surgery the very week the forged letter surfaced, a visit that had struck Mrs. Pratt as odd at the time, only because the Dowager Duchess was in perfect health and had no evident reason to consult a physician at all. Eleanor went to Dr. Fenn herself, not as the widow Hale, but, for the first time since her return, as Eleanor Ashworth, and found a man who had spent 5 years carrying a guilt he had never had the courage to set down. He did not need to be threatened into honesty. He needed only, it turned out, to be asked a direct question by the woman he had wronged, and to discover that she was willing to hear the whole of his answer before deciding what to do with it. She came to me, he said, sitting very still with his hands flat on his own desk, and told me your ladyship's condition, the coming birth, had put you in danger of a fever, and that it would spare the family a great deal of grief if I were prepared, should the worst occur, to certify accordingly, quietly, without troubling the family further than necessary. I did not understand until later what she meant to use it for. By the time I understood, the letter had already done its work, and you were already gone, and I told myself there was nothing left to be done by speaking, and that was cowardice, Your Grace, and I have known it for cowardice every day since. Will you say so before others? Eleanor asked. If I ask it of you, Doctor. Fenn looked at her a long moment, an old man weighing the last respectable years of his life against a debt he had let compound for half a decade, and said, Yes, I will. The second piece came from an unlikely quarter. Miss Priscilla Rowe herself, who called at Peg Doyle's cottage unannounced one grey April afternoon. Having heard, the county could keep no secret long, once Mrs. Pratt and Dr. Fenn had begun, however quietly to talk, enough of the truth to feel the ground shift under an engagement she had entered in good faith and increasing private unease. I did not know, Priscilla said, sitting very upright, gloved hands in her lap, in a room far plainer than any she was accustomed to. I want you to believe that, whatever else you think of me. I knew there had been a first wife who left under a cloud. I did not know she had been driven from her own home with a child not yet born, and I did not know the Dowager Duchess had a hand in it, and I will not stand up in a church and be married to a man on the strength of a lie I have only just learned I was part of. You are not my enemy, Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. You were offered a bargain in good faith by people who had already broken faith with someone else. That is not the same as breaking it yourself. What will you have me do? Tell the truth of what you knew, and when you knew it, if it is ever asked of you, Eleanor said. That is all. I do not need your ruin. I have had enough of ruin visited on people who did not deserve the whole of it. Priscilla Rowe left that cottage with an unlikely gratitude she had not expected to feel, and would, within the fortnight, break her own engagement quietly, and without scandal, on grounds she declined to specify to anyone but her own father, who was, in the event, considerably more relieved than his ledgers strictly should have allowed him to be. The third piece, and the decisive one, came from the parish register itself, the very chest Julian had sat beside in the cold without opening it, back before he had known what he was afraid to find. Eleanor went to the old chapel with Mr. Edmund Carr, the county's precise, unbending solicitor, a man with no patience for anything he could not verify twice, and together they found not only the record of her marriage to Julian, plain and unforged and 5 years undisturbed in its ink, but also, tucked behind it by a hand that had clearly hoped no one would trouble to look, a note in Augusta's own writing to Dr. Fenn, thanking him for his discretion regarding the matter of the certificate, dated the very week of Eleanor's banishment. That, Mr. Carr said, holding the note to the light with the flat satisfaction of a man who has just watched an equation resolve, is not proof of forgery in itself, but set beside the letter, and the physician's own account, and the housekeeper's memory of the timing, it builds a case no reasonable magistrate could set aside. Augusta Ashworth, informed by a frightened maid that the widow Hale had been seen twice at the old chapel with the county solicitor, did not sit idle. She went, in the last week of April, to Julian directly, and attempted the one weapon she had never yet needed to use against her own stepson, a document of her own, an affidavit sworn before a magistrate of her acquaintance 2 counties off, alleging that the woman calling herself Eleanor Hale was in fact an impostor, a fortune-seeking woman who had learned the details of a 5-year-old scandal and meant to use a child of convenient age and colouring. to extort a settlement from a guilt-stricken duke. I will not have this family's name dragged through Cressbridge's assembly rooms a second time, Augusta said, standing very straight in the estate office, on the word of a woman who cannot even produce a marriage line. She can, Julian said, quietly, produce precisely that. I have seen it myself, in the chapel register, in your late husband's own chapel, which you might have thought to search before you swore an affidavit accusing her of lacking it. Something in Augusta's face moved, very slightly, the first crack Eleanor would later hear had ever shown in that composure, and then closed again, smooth as poured cream. Then we shall let the county decide whose account it prefers, she said at the assembly, before everyone, since you seem determined to make a public spectacle of a private family matter regardless of my counsel. Yes, Julian said. We shall. The Hallishire Spring Assembly was held that year, as it was held every year, in the long room above the Cressbridge Assembly Hall, and the county came in numbers that April evening, precisely because word had travelled, in the way word always travels in a place small enough to know its own business, that something was to be settled there, that no one wanted to miss. Eleanor came in a gown Peg Doyle had helped her make over from a length of good grey silk Mrs. Pratt had produced, without explanation, from an Olden Court storeroom, plain, unornamented, exactly the sort of dress a woman wears who intends to be believed rather than admired. Simon stayed with Annie Doyle that night, by Eleanor's own choice, whatever was to be said in that room. She would not have her son present to hear his own legitimacy debated like an item of account. She did not raise her voice once, the whole of that long evening. She stood before the assembled county, the Rowe family in the second row. Priscilla's chin lifted in a manner that told Eleanor she had kept her word. Tom Kettle at the back near the door, come in his good coat, though gatekeepers were not, strictly invited. Mrs. Pratt seated near the front with her hands folded like a woman at a funeral she had waited 5 years to attend, and she laid out, in order, without a single raised word, the marriage line from the chapel register, the note in Augusta's own hand to Dr. Fenn, and asked, simply, whether anyone present wished to examine either document for themselves before she said another word. Mr. Carr examined them for the room's benefit, aloud, in the flat, precise voice of a man reading figures he has already checked twice, and pronounced both authentic beyond reasonable dispute. This is monstrous, Augusta said, from where she stood near the fireplace, her voice for the first time in the whole affair not quite level. A servant's memory and a private note prove nothing. Any woman may forge a register entry given enough. I did not forge the entry, said a voice from the back of the room, and every head turned as Reverend Sim, the curate who had married them 5 years before, and long since removed to a parish 2 counties off, stepped forward. Having been summoned that very week by Mr. Carr, and kept, until this moment, quietly out of sight. I performed that marriage myself, and I have kept my own private record of it these 5 years, which I have brought with me tonight, since I understood there was some question of it. Dr. Fenn spoke next, unprompted, his voice shaking only slightly, and told the room, in full, what he had told Eleanor in his surgery, the visit, the request, the certificate he had not, in the end, been asked to complete, because Eleanor had never obliged anyone by dying, only by surviving, quietly, elsewhere, for 5 hard years. It was Tom Kettle who delivered the blow no one, least of all Augusta, had thought to prepare for. He came forward from the back of the room, cap in his hands, plainly uncomfortable in that company, and said, in his slow, careful way, that he had been sent, some 5 years back, by the Dowager Duchess's own maid, a girl since married and moved away. But reachable, he said, and willing to swear the same, to carry a letter to the receiving house in Cressbridge addressed to a gentleman in Bath, and that he had thought nothing of it at the time, being a groom and not paid to think, until he had heard, this past winter, the shape of the story the widow Hale's return had begun to tell, and had realised whose hand he had likely helped deliver a lie in. I didn't know what it was, he said. I know now. I reckon I ought to say so. The room's turning, when it came, was not loud. It was the particular silence of a great many people revising, all at once and without a word spoken among them, an opinion they had held comfortably for 5 years, and then the low current of talk beneath it, the county doing what the county always did, recalibrating its verdict in real time, and Augusta Ashworth stood by the fireplace, with every face in the room no longer looking at her the way it had looked an hour before, and something behind her composure, some last held wall, visibly went out. I did what I believed necessary, she said, into the quiet, for this family's survival. You did what was convenient, Eleanor said, and called it necessity, and that is a distinction I have had a great deal of time to learn, madam, in the 5 years your convenience cost me. She let that sit a moment before she went on, and when she did her voice did not sharpen, if anything it softened, which struck the room harder than fury would have. I will not ask that you be prosecuted. I could. Mr. Carr assures me the case would stand, but I have not come back to this county to ruin a frightened old woman, only to stop being ruined by one. You will make a public correction of the record, here, tonight, in your own words, and you will withdraw from any further management of this family's affairs, and you will make restitution to Dr. Fenn's conscience, and to whatever servants you used, and never once thanked for it. That is the whole of what I will require. It is, I think, considerably less than you offered me. Augusta Ashworth, who had built her entire life on the principle that composure was armour, found in that moment that armour alone does not answer a question asked plainly before a room that has already decided the truth of it. And she made her correction, haltingly, in a voice gone suddenly old, and the county heard it, and that, more than any magistrate's ruling could have done, was the whole of her sentence. The apology that mattered most to Eleanor, in the weeks that followed, was not Augusta's, which she accepted as payment rather than as reconciliation, filed and closed like a settled account. It was Julian's, offered a second time, properly, alone, in the estate office, where their marriage had once lived its best hours, with the ledgers open between them the way they used to be. I want you to understand, he said, that I am not asking you to come back because the county now approves of it. I would want you back if every soul in Halishire still believed the lie. I have had 5 years to learn the difference between wanting a woman because she is convenient to want, and wanting her because the house does not breathe right without her, and I know now which one this is, and I am ashamed it took me so long to learn to tell them apart. That is nearly a choice statement, Eleanor said, with the first real warmth he had heard in her voice since the brook. Say the rest of it. I choose you, Julian said, not because you have proven yourself useful to this estate, though God knows you have, twice over. Because you are the only person who has ever made me want to be a better accounting of a man than fear alone would have made me. I have been choosing you, I think, since before I knew I had stopped. All right, Eleanor said. All right, then, said Julian, and something in his chest, some door bricked shut for 5 years, came fully open at last. She did not move back into Oldham Court that week, nor the next. She told him plainly that words, however well chosen, were the cheapest thing he had to offer her, and that she would want proof measured in ordinary days before she measured it in declarations. And Julian, to his lasting credit, did not argue the point, only set about proving it. It showed itself in small units, the way real change always does. He had a second chair drawn up beside his own at the estate office desk, not across from it, and left the household ledgers open on the days she came to review them, sharing the columns rather than presenting them for her approval. He learned to pour her tea before she asked for it, and to stop before he handed it to her and simply set it within her reach, because she had told him once, gently, that being served and being seen were not always the same act, and he wanted, this time, to offer the second. He asked Simon, each visit, 3 questions about his day, and listened to the whole of the answers, even the meandering ones, in a way that made the boy's shoulders unknot a little further each week. There was one slip, in early June, that told Eleanor more than a month of small kindnesses had. Julian, without asking her, arranged for a tutor to begin instructing Simon in Latin, a perfectly reasonable thing for a future duke to require, and informed Eleanor of the arrangement only after it was made, in the old habit of a man used to deciding things for a household rather than with one. "You did not ask me," Eleanor said quietly when he told her. Julian stopped. She watched the old instinct war, visibly, with the new one he was building, and win against himself only after a long pause. "I did not," he said. "I fell back into it without noticing. You are right to name it. I will cancel the arrangement and put the question to you properly, if you'll have me do it again. You need not cancel a good tutor over a lapse honestly caught and corrected," Eleanor said. "I need only know that you will keep catching it. That is the whole of what proof looks like, Julian, not perfection." "Correction," he nodded, and did not repeat the lapse again in any matter that touched her authority, and Eleanor, watching him learn it, felt something in her own chest loosen that she had kept clenched for 5 years, the counted grief ration she had never quite spent down to nothing finally, quietly, waved. They were married again, properly, publicly, before the whole of Halishire this time, in the parish church at Marrow Fen with Reverend Sim brought back to perform it, and Simon standing between them in a blue coat that made half the county smile at the echo of a portrait in the long gallery. In the autumn of that year, 18 months as it happened, from the wet afternoon she had stood at his gate and been offered no bread. 2 years further on, Oldham Court no longer held its breath the way it once had. The estate's tenant wages, posted now on a board in the steward's office at Eleanor's own insistence, were paid in full and on time, the first estate in Halishire to make such a thing public rather than a private mercy dispensed and forgotten. A school met 3 mornings a week in the old chapel, where a register had once nearly been the only proof left of a marriage the world had tried to erase, and Peg Doyle's Annie stood at its front some mornings, teaching her letters to children who might otherwise never have learnt them, in a post Eleanor had created and funded from the estate's own restored accounts. Tom Kettle no longer minded the gate. He managed the home farm now, promoted on the strength of a testimony he had never expected would matter, and a competence no one had troubled to notice until it did. The ring that had once hung hidden on a cord beneath a beggar's collar sat now plainly on Eleanor's hand, where Julian had placed it a second time before the whole parish, and its meaning had turned over entirely in the turning. Once the last proof of a marriage the world had denied, It was now simply a marriage, worn in daylight, requiring no proof at all, because no one troubled any longer to doubt it. Simon, 7 now, still had his father's chin and his father's exact scowl over his letters, and had lately taken to correcting the steward's arithmetic with a confidence that made Mrs. Pratt laugh outright at the dinner table, a sound the old housekeeper had not made freely in years. The house at Oldham, guests remarked, had a different air to it than it once had, warmer, less careful of itself, the particular ease of a place that has stopped holding its breath, and finally, after a long cold season, learned to exhale. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee. Not because a duke finally troubled to look, but because she had spent 5 hard years building a life so plainly, so thoroughly her own, that looking away from it had become, at last, the harder thing to do. A closed gate is not the same as a locked one, her father used to say, and she had proven it true the long way, the only way that ever really counts. And love, when it finally returned to her, came not as rescue, but as verdict, freely given, on terms she alone had set, which is the only kind of love in the end that a woman like her had ever needed to keep. There is something in Eleanor's story that I think about long after the page ends, how the people who devalue us are so rarely stopped by anger, and so often undone, quietly and completely, by simple proof of who we were all along. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, I hope you felt that reckoning land the way I did writing it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, if you'd been standing in that assembly room, which moment would have turned you first, the register, the note, or the boy at the water's edge, saying the one word his father least expected to hear. I'll be back soon with another story of quiet strength finally getting its due. Until then, take care of yourselves.